Welcome everyone to the Bradford seminar, and I'm sorry for the food-related delay, but I know you folks won't be happy just hearing words. You have to have your nourishment. Our guest today is Maxwell Boykoff, who's the director of the Center for Science and Technology Policy and associate professor in the Environmental Studies program at the University of Colorado. Max got his PhD in Environmental Studies at UC Santa Cruz. And knowing Max personally over many years, I'll say that he's one of the very few go-to experts on environmental communications, whose judgment I always trust. He's a co-author and editor of 6 books and edited volumes, along with over 50 peer-reviewed articles in book chapters. He's also my colleague as one of the editors at Climatic Change, and the editor was probably the toughest job because he sits atop a complex scholarly field related to the social interactions involving climate and society, which is not only there are a lot of papers, not only do they cover disparate material requiring good discerning judgment by an editor, but there is also a terrain of which can involve a lot of controversy. Today's topic is creative climate communications, productive pathways. It's a lot of alliteration in here. Creative climate communications, productive pathways for science, policy, and society. Please join me in welcoming Max.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was a really kind introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all today, and really value the time that we've got up until I'm told that you all leave promptly at 1 o'clock. So I'm going to do my best to share with you some prepared remarks, and then open up a conversation, which I think could be really great for me to hear your perspectives on these types of issues, but then also give you the chance to ask me some additional questions. So before I get started, I do want to say just thank you again to Michael for inviting me here and for that kind introduction. It's wonderful to be a colleague with Michael and then have this opportunity as a result. Thanks also to Chuck for your help with coordination. And Keely, I'm not sure if Keely's here, but we've exchanged emails before, so it's nice to see you now. What I'm going to do, I guess I have written and edited 6 books now. This is a 7th. I'm going to focus in on this one. Actually, it only turns out to be the 2nd monograph, but those seem to be a bit more of a challenge in getting them out. But I am pleased to say that this one will be out this summer, and it really has been a chance for me essentially to delve into the social sciences and humanities research that props up what constitutes essentially effective communication about climate and environment. So I'm going to present ideas, insights, and arguments that populate this book. And it really, for me, I was motivated by what has felt like an overdue interrogation and exploration of how to pull on the levers of creativity to achieve effective climate conversations. So at the outset, I want to say, and I will repeat a number of times, that this book doesn't offer some kind of recipe book or a magic or silver bullet in these kinds of topics, that they are definitely context dependent. But having said that, I don't want to squander the chance to have dug into all this. It really was a privilege to scour these literatures. I do provide guidance that I'll get to here in a bit. Kind of some of the core arguments that I'm going to put before you are the following. First, amidst high quality and well-funded scientific research into the causes and consequences of climate change, our communications or conversations about climate change in our lives have been stuck. This has been due in part to low levels of funding for interdisciplinary work, social sciences, humanities, grappling with this, but it also has to do with coordination across these fields. It has also been due in part to suboptimal communication approaches. For example, as I'll get into more examples, there is this notion of the locus of agency often remaining problematically stuck at solely the individual level. And there is then this reliance on an information deficit model to meet individuals and change individuals. And moving across those scales is critically important, and I've written about it. I may not touch on it so much today, though. Some of these studies that have been done to date have been confined to the spaces, say, of environmental psychology, behavioral science, but there are also important political economic dimensions that I hope to touch on here. And really getting at, secondly then, that perspectives to date have needed to improve the ways in which they're dealing with communication as an integrated function of these exchanges and interactions. As a result, some of the 21st century landscapes are dotted with climate silence, are dotted with a lack of engagement, are dotted with deep partisanship, politicization, and polarization. So I was compelled to write this to integrate these spaces and help at least provide the beginnings of a way to confront these pervasive, chronic, and overdue challenges. So rather than this silver bullet notion, I put forward the premise that there is silver buckshot approaches, which are many strategies for different audiences to effectively reach them in different contexts. There is a time and place for just about, not everything, but just about everything. And so tactics can emanate from approaches to effectively meet people where they are, to recapture common ground, and then make progress on these critical issues. And so progress doesn't happen on its own, of course. It requires this kind of multi-scale coordination. And the archaic view here, essentially, that I challenge is that we aren't dumbing down complex climate science for the general public. This is about smartening up those spaces of interaction. So some of the context, scientific ways of knowing about these issues has really been the dominant way of understanding climate change over the last 40, 50 years. This has been populated by many assessment reports. Michael has a book, a co-authored book that's out that's praising and wrestling with some of the effectiveness of expert-led assessment reports. But this is where we have been for quite a while. There is this expertise that's brought to bear on a complex issue like this that we can't grasp just looking out the window. We rely on experts to make sense of these things around us. However, with that scientific-led approach to knowing about climate change, we've also faced a certain set of challenges. This is drawn out in this quote by Brian Rinn, who's a science and technology studies scholar, who talks about how the deficit model is dead, but long live the deficit model. Essentially what he has said in many places and argued is that this notion that we can fill people up with the science to make the quote-unquote right choice is oftentimes the way that we approach these issues, but it doesn't work. Nonetheless, when you press on people, they retreat to their levels, their spaces of expertise, which often those authorized speakers are within the sciences, and they adhere then continually to this deficit model. This is not to lambast or villainize any in the climate science community, but rather to say that we need to broaden out our engagements. We need to draw more systematically on the social sciences and humanities. Susie Mosier, who's a researcher who I have leaned on quite a lot, who I've actually co-edited a book with, has said that providing information and filling knowledge gaps is at best necessary, but rarely sufficient to create active behavioral engagement. And so to that I would add sustained behavioral engagement, the kind of sustained engagement that's needed for these types of challenges. So it is the beginning, and what is important is to open up other pathways to knowing about climate change in order to then facilitate and amplify opportunities to make progress. So putting this in a bit of context, there are these moments in time. I've just pulled out a few of the protest signs that have been a part of the climate march, have been part of the March on Science, and they've helped me to kind of think through and articulate in this book different ways of knowing. This one's a particular favorite of mine. What do we want? Science-based policy. When do we want it? After peer review. So these are some of these moments in time. And even more recently, a moment in time, I pull up a few photographs from a House Committee on Oversight and Reform that took place just this past week, just a little bit less than a week ago. Was it last Tuesday? Michael Oppenheimer was involved in a subcommittee meeting that took place in the afternoon. These photos came from more of the attention-grabbing morning session of the full committee. And here in these spaces, part of the moments in time were the privileging. This is Senator Massey from Kentucky on the left, who had talked about photosynthesis deniers is something that he cropped up as from the left that are pushing forward climate change. And the ways in which that got traction is just one indication among many that there needs to be a lot more work done to quell and to preempt the efficacy of those kinds of ridiculous statements. There are a few others that I can maybe return to later. It sounds to me, just from hearing a bit more about that afternoon meeting, that it was a bit more productive. However, the morning meeting, which grabbed a lot more of the headlines, which then get translated into the public arena to everyday people, had still had many caricatures of particular arguments. And these are the moments in time where we sit. So the top line theses for this book: one, we need to have a sustained assessment of creative climate communications and provide that useful and needed resource and guide. And then two, we essentially need to confront urgent needs to smarten up communications about climate change. Basically, to date, the groping that we've done and pulling on particular studies to prop up arguments that may or may not ultimately prove effective have not created a sustained level of engagement that's needed. And so this can then help to match with the demands of a 21st century changing environment through a 21st century communications environment. So this book really takes that kind of high level, maybe 30,000 foot view, and works through a number of different studies that have sought to better understand what works, how, when, and why, and under what circumstances. It helps wrestle with the lessons from social sciences and humanities research and practices. Some of them that don't always agree, some of them that work through various contexts, but ultimately to seek to improve this understanding that we need to tailor communications for particular audiences in particular times and places. So with that, just on that notion of audience, I do want to point out that I have written this book for an academic press, Cambridge University Press. So the primary audience in my thinking as I worked through this is fellow researchers and practitioners that are working to improve effectiveness of climate communications. Beyond that, kind of a secondary audience that I had in mind were students, both undergrad and graduate students who take an interest in this. This is an emerging field. Courses that I teach at CU Boulder are oversubscribed routinely, trying to work through these issues, that then are future creative content producers, future leaders. And then also the tertiary community that I had in my mind and wrote this for are other natural scientists and policymakers who can incorporate these lessons into their practices. And so those are the ways in which I had approached this particular book. So through case studies and examples, I examine who might be creative and effective messengers, what are some of the creative and effective messages about climate change, where are the intended or perceived audiences, when can these strategies be deployed effectively, and what are the current conditions for this communications ecosystem to operate both ideally and in reality. So the chosen title I didn't mean to be cheeky about this, if you will, that the reason that I have this in parentheses are twofold. So first of all, I really have written this in a way that I hope that if you all here, part of my perceived audience, are working on climate communication specifically, there are transferable guidelines, rules, and lessons that can be taken away to analogous scientific, political, cultural, societal issues coursing through our veins, our societal veins, if you will. That issues like GMOs, vaccinations, nuclear power, stem cell research can, I hope, take some of these insights and apply them usefully. Secondly, part of the premise here is that when one is mindful of audience, that ultimately, effective communications can involve not invoking climate change explicitly. This is something that is definitely circulated. It came up in one of our earlier discussions with Noah, that these have been emerging as a strategy on the ground. However, this book I've tried to pull together the research that really props up and supports that notion going forward. I mean, it's not to suggest at all that we should blunt our communication goals and objectives to take action on climate change. Doesn't mean we should shy away from them, but we need to be smarter about it and more creative. So rather than treating it, my son who's in the back there, a high schooler, who's looking at Princeton University, he's kind of told me it's a little bit like Voldemort. That you don't want to have it like he who cannot say his name, but maybe a little bit more. To pull in another very different cultural reference, a little bit like Fugazi. Does anyone know Fugazi? The say it to my face mentality. Okay, I digress a little bit. So there are many times and places for this, but the naming, shaming, and blaming only gets us so far. And so to lead with climate change may have limited effectiveness, and to really build bridges into certain communities that are embedded stakeholders, that do have a voice, a necessary voice in all of this, means tailoring these communications to maybe not invoke climate or climate change all the time. So there is discussion, for instance, of the notion of future-proofing in Texas. There are ideas of stewardship and responsibility that are resonant terms with many fishing communities, for instance, in Colorado, or hunting communities. In short, smart communication is what's advised. So in terms of these pathways to knowing about climate change, there really has been a multi-decade history through the arts and social sciences about how to engage with creativity effectively. This particular project isn't about creativity for creativity's sake, but it is about creativity to harness effective social and environmental change. And that's a little bit of another leap that maybe I'll return to, time permitting, about some of the challenges that this kind of work faces. But a lot more needs to be done to advance the value of this in the public arena. And I want to just share with you maybe a vignette of one of these chapters where I address one particular aspect of this around academic climate advocacy and activism, and then dwell a little bit more deeply in the content from one other chapter about how we've used humor and comedy to engage with people on climate change. So with this first chapter, I just want to say that this actually emanated from an earlier piece that I'd written in the Journal of Climatic Change, along with David Onk, examining the promises and perils of academic climate advocacy. We had done some survey research into this. We actually found that there was broad agreement that this was a pressing issue amongst the natural, social scientists, and humanities researchers that we surveyed. We found that women are more likely to engage in advocacy, and that it shouldn't be criticized as viewed by women as much as their male social and natural scientist counterparts had said. We also found that younger respondents were more likely than older respondents to be compelled to change by advocacy writ large, and especially from someone with a smaller carbon footprint. This had built on research that's done by John Kocher, Shazim Atari, and others, trying to better understand how academic climate researchers can effectively work in the public arena to communicate about climate change. So in the book chapter itself, actually had staked out in very broad terms, these three types of advocacy. Type 0 advocacy is essentially those who choose not to engage in advocacy. This can be sometimes through disinterest in engagement, sometimes owing to confusion or conflation of perceptions of advocacy. But inaction is essentially a choice, and it is a form of action in this case. Type 1 advocacy, in very broad terms, is advocacy for scientific evidence. Actually, in Michael's co-authored book that has just come out, they talk about proximity of expertise, which I think is an important way to advance this further. In broad terms, though, advocacy for scientific evidence can be considered type 1 advocacy. And so we can see that there are a couple of people that we could point to of prominent type 1 advocates, Catherine Hayhoe on the left, Neil deGrasse Tyson in the center, and then type 2 advocacy, as his role has changed over time, could be considered as James Hansen, and advocacy for particular policy outcomes. Now, if you are familiar with the work of these folks, you know that these are dynamic spaces of interaction. These are perhaps nodes within a spectrum of choices that are made, and you can't just pigeonhole someone into type 0, 1, or 2. This changes over time. This is part of the humanizing aspect of what we do as climate researchers or as communicators in this space. So we can see something like a tweet from Neil deGrasse Tyson just a few days ago that says, I guess you could read it, it can draw out the partisan nature of these issues around climate change without delving into any particular policy outcome. And Neil deGrasse Tyson is very deliberately taking up that type 1 advocacy as a result of where he feels he's most effective. Okay. So I'm going to turn to a very different kind of way of accessing, knowing about climate change. And that's through a project that we have, I say we, it's a theater professor and ecology and evolutionary biologist, a communications professor at me, that we've been involved in at the University of Colorado now for a number of years. We have, excuse me, tapped into comedy as a vehicle to connect up, to share information, ideas, ways of thinking and acting that can circumvent, in many cases, the kind of partisanship and polarization that has weighed down these issues in the public sphere. Comedy, very broadly, has the way to bring forth multiple truths, ways of knowing, this notion of delight, but with pushing forward ideas and meaning. Comedy actually can be very effective in exploiting incongruities, hypocrisies, falsehoods, pretentiousness that wiggle in, poke, prod, and point out these kinds of issues. It has the power then to destabilize certain discourses and threaten what can be considered to be entrenched and ossified views. So there is this way in which power flows through, and it has compelled us then to take part in what we've anchored as a stand-up comedy experience on the campus of CU Boulder now for 3 of the last 4 years, but is also related to an international video competition that we've held at the university, which actually closes today, should you have any great videos, 3 minutes or less, that you'd like to submit to our competition. But it's a way in which we can create an experimental space where we've then studied this, and particularly with Beth Osnes, the theater professor. She and I have published a paper that's just come out in Political Geography where we study through these methods of participant surveys, audience member surveys, content analysis, and participant observations, how this had played out with this particular group. It's largely students, undergraduate students for the most part, at the university. But then we've also brought it up to what are some of the patterns, what are some of the takeaways that we can use. So we really, it's more of a theoretical piece, really, than solely empirical. But we really wanted to get at the different flavors of comedy. We're actually following it up. This particular show that we have very shortly, a week from Thursday, is about getting at good-natured comedy. There are different flavors of comedy. This is about good-natured comedy is essentially this humorist who stands arm in arm with its subject or subjects. There are definitely the satirists that mock subjects either from a superior position or stand below as a victim that can punching up and punching down. That had populated a lot of our work here, and we're trying to delve into and wrestle with this idea of what can be good-natured comedy to bring us into this collective experience. So in broad terms, I mentioned shortly that there is having a good time and laughing, but then there's also this movement towards social change. And that is the difficult part. We hope everybody has a great time a week from Thursday night, but we also try and introduce that notion of change and engagement, where these climate change issues through comedy can increase the salience of them. It can offer, comedic approaches can offer new ways of knowing about climate change. It can help increase accessibility of complex often distant issues. It can engage new audiences who want to come out for comedy and get a dose of information about climate change along the way. This actually has been found through other research by Katie Boren-Chadu at American University, very interestingly, that it can increase broadly, comedy can increase the retention of information through effective storytelling. This can just simply provide some good belly laughing, which can be some physical relief, mental relief, amid anxiety of thinking about the causes and consequences of climate change. But ultimately, this seeks to bridge difficult topics and along the way to empower new voices, which are those performers on stage. We've increasingly been getting more stand-up acts. For any of you who are connoisseurs of performance and comedy, stand-up is incredibly difficult, but we've gotten more and more people who want to do that kind of work. Then we also have skits and sketches and those sorts of things. This also builds on work before it, and so the way that I treat it in the book is in part to share the research findings that we have, but also to build on people like Lauren Feldman, Ashley Anderson, Amy Becker, Paul Brewer, Jessica McKnight, who have studied this in the social sciences, mainly through television programs like The Daily Show, like John Oliver, and these sorts of things, to better understand how comedy can help bridge these conversations. So we've been involved in many of these different iterations, and it has involved multimodal, not just performance, but also some video work over time. We found that, like Woody Allen's quote, comedy is either easy, but most likely it's often found to be impossible. So we have worked very hard to get into these spaces, but it certainly is an experiment as we go. What we had studied then, the systematic study, is of 5 key themes. How does it raise awareness? How does it affect notions of efficacy? How does it shape feelings or emotion or affect grouped together? How does it enhance engagement and problem solving? And then finally, the 5th, how does it affect learning and new knowledge formation? Within this limited study, we have found mild successes within each of those arenas. However, it hasn't come without many drawbacks and challenges. There's capacity and confidence building that's involved in these experiences, in these performances, as reported by audience and participants themselves. However, there are challenges such as the anxiety of connecting up climate change with humor, in the sense that it runs the risk of taking something that's very serious and adding levity and potentially irreverence to it, and diminishing and trivializing its importance. And so that is part of the challenges that we face. But there remains this very important dimension of the disarming and subversive power of comedy to open up these spaces. And Beth Osnes, who's the theater professor, has studied histories of comedy and has helped me to better understand and work with these ways in which crowd involvement, generous laughing, like you're doing right now, generous laughing, as much as for the actor who forgot her lines as for the one who landed the joke, drive forward this collective experience. It's this active spectatorship that moves someone from a passive recipient of information into someone who feels as though they have some semblance of agency. Now, this is limited in our case to these live performances, but we're now broadening out to think about other ways to engage. So it is distinct from television communications, and it is to date focused in on college-age or college-age youth, if you will, or college-age young adults. But we are hopefully just providing a test bed for other research to follow as well. So, you know, it is an open set of considerations, that there is this way in which some of these comedic acts can immediately go to that solely individualized space, that it can atomize that are necessary. But there is this space of licensed transgression, if you will, that opens up opportunities for new ways to consider climate change. In so doing, we have found that through this research so far, there has been both salve, it's important, but then the seed to attend to and create these possible emancipatory experiences, ways to grow new ideas and new forms of engagement. So with that, one final challenge is that in doing that, there still remains this maybe niggling issue that we continue to put out there, is that we can empower our students, we can make them feel as though their voices are heard, we can help them have a good and productive time as creative storytellers, but there still is this semblance of engagement that can happen within the confined spaces of political economic order on these issues. And I hope that makes sense. Essentially, that it still can be seen to be confined within the spaces of our normal operating procedures. And so we continue to work with that and work with how to then confront norms of climate injustice, inequalities perpetrated across gender, class, and culture. And it still remains one of the challenges that we have in doing that with humor. So just to maybe wrap this case study up, at least my initial thoughts on it, to work towards some semblance of a conclusion, I just want to say that, again, context, cultural context, political context, is incredibly important. Mary Douglas, anthropologist, has pointed this out. Many others have done as well. There's a few short examples that I can provide to animate this. One, James Inhofe, Republican Oklahoma Senator. I think he was chair of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee at the time. February 2015, brought a snowball into the floor of the Senate and kind of lobbed it to somebody. Tried to use it as evidence that the globe wasn't warming because of a particular snowstorm. Funny, perhaps. The traction that it got in a variety of ways for different audiences, it was reason for pause about how comedy and humor can move through these spaces. Second example, very quickly, White House Correspondents' Dinner. Michael Key, an influential person in my son Elijah's life. He actually had been an anger translator for Barack Obama at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And it's just a way of using comedy where he was trying to tone down the message and finding some resonance with those in the audience. Third example, different example, current President Donald Trump was at the UN General Assembly in the fall 2018 in New York City, and he said something to the effect of, he has been doing a great deal on climate change. And everybody in the, maybe not everybody, but a large segment laughed at him. And it was really destabilizing. If you go back and watch this, he said, that wasn't what I was expecting, but you can see the destabilizing power of comedy in this particular case. So each of them provides slightly different insights, but can illustrate that they're all very embedded in these social situations and the times in which they occur. So before I get to a conclusion, though, in working through all this and really having the privilege to get to read my brains out and try and put all this together through the work that I've done now for over a decade in these arenas, is while I can't offer up a recipe book for you all, there isn't some disembodied guide that you can then apply to any issue. I do not want to stop short and just say everything is complicated. Thank you very much. There are certain ways in which we can attend to rules of the road. We can attend to features of a roadmap, as I call it, to better engage and more effectively engage on climate change and other topics, as informed by social sciences, literature, and humanities research. The book that I wrote is about, I think it's 120,000 words in total, but like 15,000 of them are references, because it hopefully will provide that beginning for you to then delve into, if you choose to read it, into these other bits of research that to date have been kind of a fragmented landscape. So part of these rules, maybe in short, I can just talk about each of them, but not dwell too much. First, important to be authentic. I'm reminded of Stephen Schneider's quote that has stayed with me for many, many years: know thyself, know thy audience, and know thy stuff. I think knowing thyself is the way that I think through this first one. If you like Catherine Hayhoe, are part of an evangelical community, you can speak authentically to those communities. If you're a part of other communities, you can think about ways in which you can speak authentically through your lived experiences. But these disingenuous, phony approaches to throw on a cowboy hat and go talk to ranchers often proves ineffective and hollow and can have a detrimental effect. So authenticity is very important. Secondly, being aware. Motivated attentiveness to really reaching the people that you want to reach. This, for me, is the second part of the quote. Knowing your audience with respect, empathy, humility, awareness of scales of engagement and interdependencies, that this can be part of what scales effective responses as well and suggestions for action. Third, be accurate. This is the know thy stuff part. I think that we ought not also consider this issue as one that you can just tie up in a good communication strategy and you're good. You have to adhere to what the science to date can explain, how much we can attribute, for instance, extreme events to the changing climate, and know thy stuff. And so it can be associated with ideas of legitimacy and trust going forward. Fourth, be imaginative. That experimentation, I would like to think like the comedic experimentation, we don't always have the answers, but we're willing to work through them. It involves nimbleness, agility, ability to adapt and learn and change. And so it's taking risks, making mistakes, sometimes suspending self-stigmatism in order to try and gain some insight into these arenas. And then last, be bold about this. That to match the challenges of 21st century climate change requires a scaled engagement and a bold engagement. And so working to strengthen collective solidarity, sparking conversations, discussions, reflections is important through this boldness. And so together these tenets can increase your possibilities for creative communications, but then taking this next step of features of a roadmap of really what social sciences and humanities research have informed, not always completely consistently. There's actually a chapter in the book about this 97% consensus mean. And there isn't consensus, if you will, and the mean about consensus. It is a way to start conversations. And these are the kinds of things we wrestle with within the social sciences and humanities. But it's important to at least tether some of these features of a roadmap to the ways in which you're tailoring your communications. So first, finding common ground and meeting people where they are. This can be as much a dialogue and two-way set of communications. The social change often begins as conversations, and there's a great deal of research to support that. Secondly, emphasizing how it affects us here and now and in our everyday lives. Some of these may feel like truisms. However, when you tailor your communications to emphasizing the here and now, not to eliminate the threat to distant others, but to emphasize the here and now, has been found within social sciences and humanities research to improve the efficacy of your communication strategies. Third, focusing on how it makes our lives and livelihoods better. This is a way to control a narrative to talk about how making your commitments habitual, easy, productive, even almost fun sometimes, is a way to, Catherine Hayhoe talks about it, is a way to bond, connect, and inspire. It is a way to talk about how eliminating our mode switching to renewables has a bunch of other corollary positive impacts. That it's not to overlook some of the challenges, but also to then not lose focus of this. Fourthly, creatively empowering people to take these actions, and meaningful and purposeful action as well. Finding people ways to plug in has been a pathway to effective communication and engagement. And then fifth, just generally smartening up communications about climate change, is that it is about integrating these lessons. I will confess to you that I sometimes find myself frustrated when I read what can be considered popular and well-traveled takes on an uninhabitable Earth going forward without its relationship to social sciences and humanities research that has been done. to that point. So I do want to try and move to a conclusion so that I can open it up for questions and discussion. Before I finish, I've been indicating this a bit along the way, but this is part, at least the embedded actor portion of my work, is through this project that's called Inside the Greenhouse at the University of Colorado. So Beth Osnes is the theater professor, Rebecca Safran is the ecology professor, and Phaedra Pizzulo is the communications professor. And we've been working with students, producing research, holding events to draw out these spaces of engagement, and then assessing and examining them through our research. At the end of the day, for this, I'm motivated by trying to meet people where they are on climate change. There's a lot of work to be done to overcome status quo path dependency, political and institutional inertia. Nostalgia can be a powerful intoxicant, really. There is this yearning for an idyllic or Edenic past. I think that is part of the attraction of, say, MAGA. There is this nostalgia and this notion that things aren't the way that they used to be. But it's true. However, the struggles of today, millennials, Generation X, Y, Z, what have you, should not be judged or constrained by markers from the past. In integrating these lessons and hopefully moving forward in a more coherent and effective set of strategies will help to open up these spaces of engagement for those who are going to face impacts in the here and now and in the years to come. So my efforts here have been really to help document really good work that has been done, also to document some of the struggles of the process of advances in social sciences and humanities around creative communication about climate and environment. But it is about moving forward on methodological approaches, experimentation in these arenas. So this again takes coherence within these spaces, this interdisciplinary challenge. It also takes renewed philanthropic support. It takes renewed funding to move these things forward. So we are in, we do face many challenges now, but I encourage us to, rather than getting stuck, to move forward and get stuck in with the challenge ahead. So thank you very much.
You left plenty of time to take questions. You want to take your own questions, or should I?
I'm happy to do that. Sure. Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah, I was wondering, there's some sort of subset of climate change deniers who sort of believe themselves very well informed because you have a lot of access to data nowadays. Do you have any strategies for sort of dealing with that type of person?
Yeah, I think I do. I bet, Michael, you do as well. But to tether it to social sciences and humanities research, there is a subgroup of folks of which I'm a part who have really studied climate contrarianism over time. And one thing that I can say in short of just simply responding to, say, photosynthesis deniers, or whether you have a BA or BS in political science, is a way to just simply volley and let these memes enter into the public arena, to really move forward mindfully and purposefully with these notions, these guides of talking about the ways in which it is here and now, the ways in which it can get better, is a way to effectively squelch the efficacy of those voices. They have been amplified over time. I mean, actually, I've studied a fair bit about how the media have been happy to cover what they have to say as a broad group in the public arena. But there are certain ways in which, through employing the insights from social sciences research, that we can do a much better job of addressing them. And there's always a lot of interesting research. I think about Robert Bruhl, I think about Justin Farrell in particular. There's a whole bunch that I could continue to, Ben Frenta, Jeffrey Supan, that Justin in particular looked at how, just it's a paper that came out in the last week, Environmental Research Letters, how philanthropic organizations have been increasingly funding contrarian groups that then gives them much greater voice. So you can think upstream about this, not even necessarily responding, whether it be in a House subcommittee hearing, but thinking upstream about some of the funding that goes into prop up these organizations to begin with. Yes, please.
I think one perhaps simplistic take on the options in climate change communication seems to be this notion of hope versus fear. And it seems like from your presentation you're more in the hope camp, and you, whether intentionally or not, referenced David Wallace Wells' recent book, The Uninhabitable Earth, which very much takes the fear approach. I'm wondering from the social science research perspective whether you have a particular take on that sort of dichotomy.
Thank you. That's a great question. I didn't mean to be vague about it necessarily. I guess I was speaking about that particular book now. There is some complexity to it, of course. Just we're all complex people. But a lot of social sciences research has found that fear can only get you so far, that it actually needs to be unpacked quite a lot more. Dan Chapman has done good work on this. Ezra Markowitz has done good work. I've been involved in a project with Saffron O'Neill, who's done a lot of good work on this. It can help raise awareness about the issue, but it actually can dampen feelings of efficacy to engage. And I think that's the bottom line. And so if your communications goal is to build awareness, okay, maybe that fear approach can be useful to a point. However, if you really do want to move people and compel them to action, there is a good bit of research that has found that not to be the helpful path forward. Yes, please.
Glad to hear you're working on comedy, because I live in town here, and for the last 5 years I've led a group that's called Climate Cabaret, and I've written and performed sketches on climate change and how it's, most of them are comic. And so I just find that it's at climatecabaret.com if anyone wants to check out some videos of what we do. But I'm just curious about whether you've had experience with audiences that are self-selected versus audiences that don't come because they're interested in the subject.
Yeah, we haven't. The short answer is we haven't really unpacked that yet.
Yeah.
Naturally, the audiences that we've worked with have had an awareness of the connections that we're making between climate change and comedy. I suppose we could set up some future research to say, come for a comedy show and then surprise them with climate elements. We haven't done that work yet.
I do want to say quickly that my experience, I'm trained as a scientist. I grew up in a scientific family, and just the training I've gotten in the last 5 years, I'm in a group also that's based at McCarter. In terms of theater training, has been so helpful for communicating to people. I was never able to look people in the eye while I was thinking, because I'm so caught up in my thoughts. I don't know if you're like that. I'm a botanist, so I'm looking at the ground, talking about plants rather than looking people in the eye. Just the director I had was just able to get me to, take in all the information of all the, people around, in front of me while I'm thinking on my feet. And just that, I just wish Hillary Clinton had had my director. That's all I can say. But in terms of finding the joy and communicating and being, knowing oneself, like you say, and it's really a powerful combination when you get those two together.
It's true. I mean, just to further affirm what you're saying, is that the more that I see young academic researchers, grad students, postdocs, undergrads, integrating the importance of effective communication into the work they're doing, all the better. It feels like there is this generational shift afoot. Michael, you've always been an exception to this. You've always been a great communicator in the public arena, but it is oftentimes an exception. And so the more that people are starting to integrate these things, we co-teach a class between theater students, engineering students, and environmental studies students. And it is really fascinating to see all this play out. The students really start to feel the power of that way you describe. Yes, please.
Yes, so your efforts seem to focus on college campuses with engaged students, but what about rural residents who might be a bit more hostile, who actually have a fair amount of political power through the Electoral College? How do you reach these groups that are kind of disengaged and are denying climate change, even though they might be witnessing it. They'll have some sort of rational reason in their mind for why they're seeing these events. I mean, how do you target that audience? I think that's probably one of the toughest.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, the kind of part that I chose to share with you today is really, as you're right, focused in on college students. That larger question is a really important one. And reaching other audiences. Part of the way in which we've engineered this project at times is that we've had students work from their hometowns. I was sharing with Noah, I think earlier, that a student from Western Slope, Colorado, went back and interviewed family and friends about growing up in a mining town and finding out resonant ways of talking about these issues with them. Another student had gone and met with her father, who's a hunter, and had this piece in Viral Huntress, where he had presented his concerns about environmental stewardship, and then they cut to her and talk about her interests in studying about the environment at the university. There have been these different ways. Irrespective of the campus itself, though, I'm really pleased that there are more initiatives underway to do that kind of work, and it does take time. And some of the research that I profile in this book helps illuminate where you can do effective work in those spaces. But for instance, there's somebody at AAAS, Dan Barry, who's now finding 5 states in which to engage creatively at the local and state level. And I find that to be a really important, overdue, and promising avenue forward. Certainly there's work that's being done at different scientific organizations to meet people where they are, to find that common ground. But again, that authenticity, which is that first rule, is critically important there. That reaching out, turning to your communities of which you're a part is critically important too. So it's empowering those folks. Does that start to answer your questions? There's still work we need to do collectively.
Yeah, I mean, I think interacting in person rather than just showing somebody a video is probably more powerful. But I think also scientists are generally trusted. Maybe getting scientists into these communities to talk with people.
Yep.
Might be a strategy.
One thing I can say too is that this needs to be scaled, and many other projects. We just put our work out there and hope that others will build on that and create a more of a better collective understanding of it.
If we have time for one more?
Okay. Yes, please.
Did you go into some of the here and now talking points? Because that's something I've always had trouble with. Like, I mean, just talking with my parents, for example, like the convenience of driving or eating meat, like it's kind of outweighs the here and now inconvenience of climate change, which doesn't really affect a lot of people in spaces like this.
That's right. I mean, there can be, maybe in the everyday, a feeling of maybe insulation from the everyday set of impacts. But there are indications. There are, the ways in which extreme events are seen to really sensitize the public, and the increasing links that can be made between them and the changes in the climate is an effective way to talk about this. Water availability, heavy precipitation, drought events, ways in to talk about food issues, perhaps. And this really starts to resonate with some of your areas of expertise as well.
Okay, let me ask you one thing I'd like to know. What do you do? We've emphasized know your audience, but what if you're on one of these broad audience? You're being broadcast. What do you do?
Yeah, that is a challenge. So, for instance, say you go on the Oprah show with Leo DiCaprio. Is it you 3? And then how do you...
But at least there you have a sense of who the audience is.
Yeah.
But a lot of the stuff that goes out these days, you don't even know who's listening. Is there an optimal strategy, especially for a scientist, so that they can not do damage?
Yeah. There are insights from social sciences and humanities. Sometimes it's encased in the psychological literature about pro-environmental behavior can be perpetuated or constrained by certain ways you talk about it. So for instance, there's a new paper out. Amanda Carrico is a colleague who's worked with a team and built on a body of research that have looked at how discussing these things in terms of intrinsic motivations, values, are seen to be much more resonant in perpetuating pro-environmental behaviors, if that is your communication goal, that can be seen to be an effective strategy rather than external carbon taxation or something like that. If your goal is to raise awareness, that's a different communication goal. You can talk about that through the science. You can talk about that through the threats. But there are, again, at the risk of not providing a recipe book, because it is context dependent, I think it's an important question. If you have the opportunity to speak to a large audience that's varied across, or you don't really know, there is guidance. I mean, what I've tried to put together that can